This is Pastor Jeff Chavis. I'm the pastor of Church Online. We're based out of Las Vegas, Nevada. You can find us online at churchonline.com, but we spell that CHRCH because we say all that's missing is you. We're churchonline.com. This morning, I'm thinking about empathy. Jesus demonstrated empathy, and the truth is, he talked more about us having empathy than sympathy. Now, first you're going to ask, well, what's the difference between sympathy and empathy? Sympathy is you can sympathize, you can have a similar thought process about something. For example, someone has lost a loved one. You can feel bad for them. Now, empathy is more to feel like them. The difference being you could feel for someone, or empathy is you feel the same thing that they feel. For example, again, someone has lost a loved one that you also were close to. You're more likely to have empathy. But as I said, Jesus talked way more about empathy and his disciples having empathy more than sympathy. Now, let me tell you, this was inspired by an article I read by pastor and missionary. His name is Josh Irby. And one of the things that he said in the outset of this article that really got me scratching my head is, he went through a whole lot of statistics, and I won't get into all of that, but he said that in our culture, Christians are often viewed by non-Christians as being uncaring. But we would say that we're a very caring people. Now, he suggests in the article that some would say we might have a marketing problem in Christianity. We're not selling ourselves correctly. But he says, no, that's not the case. He says we have an empathy problem. We're not feeling what other people feel. Now, first, you got to understand the word empathy obviously is never used in the Bible. It's a 19th century word. They didn't understand that discussion. But I want to give you a demonstration of Jesus having empathy for someone else. And then once you hear the words, it'll make a lot of sense to you. And this is in Mark chapter 1, 40 through 42. It says, now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him and saying, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him and said, I am willing, be clean. As soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy had left him, and he was cleansed. In that phrase, the empathy that Jesus demonstrates is found in that verse 41. Jesus moved with compassion. And the word that's used there is, it's a deep moving in your inward parts, your guts, as you might say it. He's moved inwardly about this man's situation. That is the demonstration that Jesus gives for empathy. It's sort of like St. Augustine, that famous writer, pastor, evangelist. He did so much, but he wrote something called The City of God, and he says it like this: what is compassion but a kind of fellow feeling in our hearts for others' misery, which compels us to help by every means in our power. That's the definition of empathy. I love the way he says that. Fellow feeling in our hearts for someone else's misery, but that's not where we leave it. It compels us to help by any means possible. Jesus demonstrates this over and over. Feeding of the 4,000, also in Mark's gospel. Mark 8:2, I have compassion on the multitudes because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. He feels for them deeply. He has that St. Augustine fellow feeling in his hearts for them. And then Josh says in the article, Jesus's empathy came from his proximity, his closeness to people. He was moved to compassion along the road, among the crowds, before the people. We need to follow Jesus out from behind our walls and into the streets and among the crowds, not just to proclaim the message, but to really listen and learn and respond with the gospel. Again, empathy, and Jesus talks about it so much more than we recognize. But one of the things, for example, in the Golden Rule, in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, we have do unto others, but the way it says it in Matthew 7:12, therefore, Whatever you want men to do to you, do also for them. This is the law and the prophets. You would say, what's at the heart of the golden rule? Empathy. Listen to those words. Whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them. That means you got to know what position they are already in. If you see that individual on the streets and maybe they're holding that sign, "We'll work for food," and does your heart go out to them? But then if you have empathy, you say those words, if I were in that situation, what would I want someone to do for me? That's empathy. That means we respond in a whole different way. It's not just feeling bad for a person, it's feeling what they feel. Now we start getting into this understanding that Jesus shared. And again, if we go back to that first one, he comes across an individual who's a leper. And if you don't know, leprosy is one of those diseases that is so difficult, so hard for someone to live with. You lose your sense of touch in a certain place, maybe say your arm, your fingers, your legs, your feet, whatever it might be. You begin to lose feeling altogether. And then pretty soon, because you have no feeling, you don't even realize that you've been cut or scraped. And those cuts and scrapes get worse and worse because of the leprosy. Eventually, you may actually lose some of your extremities. Now, I thought about this picture too in a whole different way, because empathy is feeling what other people feel. And we have this tendency in our world today to actually lose the feeling, don't we? How many times do we see a tragedy on television and it becomes so commonplace to us that we don't feel anymore? Do we have sort of a leprosy on our compassion, a leprosy on our empathy? We no longer feel. We just see the events and we just blow by them as if it were nothing. Jesus would say to us, feel as I feel. Jesus moved with compassion in his inward parts, but we don't just leave it there. We do something about it. As I say those words, I don't know what you're going through and what's going on around you today, but is there a situation that requires a little bit more empathy? We're going to pray here in a few moments, and maybe that's your prayer, is that the Lord would just give you a little more empathy for people, have the empathy that he had, learn to be moved in our spirit by those things that moved him. If maybe there's some other situation and you could think of someone who is far off, maybe a relative, maybe a friend, maybe a situation, maybe someone you don't even know, but you've seen it and you know that you just need to feel more for them. Maybe that's what we need to pray about today too. Maybe it's a situation far removed from our own country, but you see those individuals and you're moved in your spirit. What can you do? Is there some way you could take action? That's having empathy like Jesus, and something that each one of us needs to learn to cultivate and develop. And yes, even pray about that the Lord would remove that leprosy of our hearts where we stop feeling.